few quick reminders. Oh, thanks a lot, David. A few quick reminders. We do have another research series event coming up this week with Tonya, who's going to be giving her talk, Fight or Flight, examining the electoral consequences of violence in Senegal. It's going to be a really important, timely conversation there. But today we're going to be featuring Professor Eric Jardine. Eric, great to see. It's been too long. One of the founding members of our cybersecurity program here at the workshop, and Eric's at Virginia Tech and has done a lot of groundbreaking work, a lot of very fascinating empirical research in particular. Today, focusing on Hezah, ransomware, externalities, cost, internalization, and security investment intentionality. I love the Hezah to begin with. Eric, such an important as well topic that we're dealing with, unfortunately, day in, day out these days. So I know it's going to be a lot of fun. I know it's going to be a great discussion. And thanks for letting us feature your research today.
Well, thank you, Scott, for having me, and welcome everybody. I see a couple of familiar names, but no familiar faces besides Scott. But it's very nice to meet you all. Yeah, so I've got some slides and I'll share them in a second. I think the big question kind of guiding this particular paper, and this is a draft and our thinking has evolved a tad since the draft itself, is more or less a look at what happens when someone's a victim of a cyber crime and whether there's differentiation between different types of attacks or types of victimization in terms of how that affects incentives to invest in future cybersecurity. And that's really what we're trying to sort of work our way through. And the Hezah part is partially my love of fantasy and dwarves, and partially because the sort of story that we're telling here is that some attack types might actually be long run more positive than others. So no attacks is better than some attacks, but if you're going to have them, maybe there's an attack type that will encourage investment in the long run, and that could be a net positive. So this is actually a collaborative work between myself, Aaron, and Dan Gear. And so the basic idea, just to put this fully into presentation mode, the basic idea is sort of a three-part sequence of logic. So at the one end, you have someone becoming a victim of a cybercrime. And from their perspective, there's going to be a cost associated with the event that caused that victimization. And there's going to be two perceived bundles. One would be the perceived costs that accrue directly to the victim themselves. And then you'd have the perceived costs, which would more nominally accrue to others. So this could be organizations that do cleanup and remediation. It could be the credit card companies if you're they need to issue cards or do fraud prevention. It could be other individuals. It's sort of a wide bundle of people outside of an individual and say the devices they directly control. Given that, and given that security costs should be in some way a condition leading into more or less security investment, it is plausible to assume then that different attack modalities might have different ratios of these attack types. And so, as those of you who've looked at the paper would know, we look at ransomware and data breach victimization in particular, and those seem to be sort of extreme poles in this sort of notion of a ratio of costs, that you have one like ransomware, which if it's targeting your laptop, for example, is going to be a highly personal cost, and another like data breach notification, suggesting an initial intrusion somewhere else that exfiltrated data from a system, that's going to be highly cost externalizing because there's a lot of other victims, nominal organizations in charge of the database, and the individual is kind of far removed. So you have this sort of notion of different ratios of ideal perceived costs. And the implication, if you start to work your way into the economics and the incentives, the security economics and the incentives that this sort of logic might imply, is that some attack types should plausibly see either more or less, depending on how you're framing it, the more or less degree of externalization of costs, and that should lead to more or less cybersecurity investment intentionality after victimization. So once you've been affected, do you decide to invest more? Do you decide to do the exact same as you were before? And it's going to be, we argue, partially a function of this sort of locus of costs. And this sort of framework has evolved from the paper, where we looked more discreetly at, I would say, the sort of classic, the classic externality notion, this idea that there are costs that are borne by a producer or a consumer, and then there are costs borne by, say, society at large. And that was where our focus had predominantly been in the beginning. And our thoughts have sort of evolved as we added perceived costs as opposed to actual costs, because that sort of opens up a wider range of things that can potentially be going into this notion of perceived externalization of costs. And so we have costliness in our sort of mental framework, but we also have added to that total costliness, because in some ways there'll be, let's say 50% of the costs are externalized. The total costliness is still going to be a relevant feature because 50% are still internal to the victim. The emotional salience of the attack, which is going to be, say, separate from what you might bundle into costliness, like which you might think of as monetary damages or time spent, whereas emotional salience could be just simply stress or anxiety or something along those lines. And then a notion that would get you close to theories like protection motivation theory, where control of the device or the targeted database or whatever, that is going to be a relevant component part here. If your laptop is compromised and your control over that is a 1-for-1, then that's, the costs are internalized and the action point is more internalized. And whereas if you're a victim of a data breach notification, like some individuals in the sample were, the actual database and what happened is largely controlled by somebody else. And so this should matter in this sort of expanded perceived cost sort of framework as well. If you wanted to render this a little bit more concrete in the setting of, as we do, data breaches and ransomware, we can kind of work through the list to the bottom row, which lays out essentially the core expectation. And in costliness, that is in terms of distribution of share, data breaches would see a lot of other individuals are being affected by this, and one person's individual notification is a relatively minor component part of the larger cost distribution associated with the attack. Whereas ransomware, although they can obviously propagate, and they're also an evolving attack form that is sort of starting to blend the boundaries with data breaches to a degree with some data exfiltration. Those are mostly targeting either individual organizations or individual people. The costliness of attacks, there's a little bit more amorphous potentially, but there are potentially high costs associated with data breaches in aggregate, probably pretty low for an individual. Whereas ransomware tends to be very historically dependent in the sense that costs are escalating over time and very scalable. So if Baltimore or Atlanta get hit with ransomware, that's going to be radically different in terms of what the ransom is if I were hit by ransomware. Emotional salience of the attack, you have, I would argue, a low to moderate salience in the case of data breaches because they have become so routinized, whereas ransomware remains somewhat high salience on an emotional scale. Or a psychological scale because it's affecting you individually and is a newer attack modality. So we may see that taper off in the future, but generally speaking, it seems like it would be fairly high. And then the control component is probably very low in the case of data breaches in most instances and very high in the case of ransomware victimization in most instances, although there can be exceptions. And if you boiled it down to plausible effects on investment intentionality, what I'd expect is that data breaches check enough of the boxes for high cost externalization, as we're sort of conceptualizing high perceived cost externalization, that you should probably see few incentives to invest more after exposure. Whereas in the case of ransomware, you'd probably expect to see a large number of incentives sort of coalescing to contribute to greater investment intentionality. And those, as we do in the paper, could be rendered formal in terms of hypotheses, but it's basically a reiteration of the idea we should expect really no difference between those exposed to data breaches and those who aren't in the last year versus we should expect a difference in cybersecurity investment intentionality in the case of ransomware exposure. To quickly walk through the methods, sample data, and then the results before sort of ending on a few discussion points, we had an initially representative sample of the US population, around 2,000 people. We use a statistical technique called optimal full statistical matching. And the goal of matching models is really to render observational data like you would get from a survey into something more akin to a fully blocked randomized control trial. It's not that. And so you have to be very careful about how stringently you interpret this. But the notion is, rather than randomize people into treatment and control groups and therefore sort of neutralize confounders, instead you match people with a statistical model and weights, which would then allow for an estimation of an average treatment effect. So instead of making a correlative claim, these models help you make more of a causal claim, although they are not as good as what you would find, obviously, in a true experiment. Our outcome measure, it takes 6 separate measures of cybersecurity investment intentionality, combines them into an index variable with a Cronbach's alpha of 0.869, which is a fairly high degree of reliability. We do a further transformation, which I'll talk about in a quick sec here, but that's the initial measurement. Our treatments are basically unique exposure to data breach in the past year. So basically you were a victim of a data breach, you received a notification letter and you self-reported that on our survey instrument, or unique exposure to ransomware. So you have your device be compromised in the last year. So there is a bit of apples to oranges in terms of this comparison, since the initial point of failure might be different, but we're asking individuals about their own experience with being a victim in either instance. So there is a degree of comparability there. And to build the matching models, we match on gender, income, age, an index variable of attitudes towards personal data, familiarity with cyber attacks, which is also an index, perceived computer competence, and online self-efficacy, both of which are, again, they're index variables. I mentioned that our outcome measure gets transformed, and we do that by taking the initial index and turning it into a Z-score. Now, the Z-score is a measure that essentially centers the distribution around the mean of the sample, and then measures deviations from that in units of standard deviation. So -1 is 1 unit of standard deviation below the mean, 1 is 1 unit of standard deviation above the mean. And it's useful in the setting of like transforming an arbitrary scale like you'd have from a series of ordinal questions about cybersecurity investment intentionality into a measure of strength of sentiment. So it's, when we talk later about the outcomes, it's basically a portion of a unit of standard deviation is what we find in terms of an effect. Diagnostically, which I won't dwell upon, we do affect good matches in both the unique data breach and the unique ransomware exposure samples, as assessed with the absolute standardized mean differences and variance ratios. Essentially, if you're going to be using statistical matching to mirror what you'd find in a randomized control trial, you need to be able to affect a good balance, and that's what we're sort of observing with our data, given the covariates that we used. Now, to the results, we had the primary predictions, and then we had sort of an interesting observation that led us to do a little bit of digging, which leads to what I would characterize as our far more tentative and inductively sort of derived result. So the results in the main sense, as they sort of pertain to hypotheses 1 and 2, is essentially that on the one hand, we have no real change in the distribution of cybersecurity investment intentionality for those who are uniquely exposed to data breaches in the previous year, as opposed to those who are not. So these two distributions in the left-hand pane here are essentially the same. The investment intentionality hovers around 0, which again is sort of the mean level and the whole sample of investment intentionality. And so the model is suggesting that exposure is an insignificant predictor of additional cybersecurity effort, or cybersecurity investment intentionality, to be more specific. And that ends up contrasting with what we observe in the case of the ransomware exposure. And here, unique exposure does, as indicated by the shift in the between the sort of teal to yellow lines, does increase the the baseline level of cybersecurity investment intentionality for those who are exposed. And if you look at the subheading right under figure 5, it's essentially more or less half a unit of standard deviation in terms of the effect of the increase. So you have a sort of an empirical prediction about the size of the effect, as well as the fact that there is a statistically significant effect. Now, where things got interesting for us in putting the paper together was basically around the sort of somewhat apparent morphological differences that have emerged with this. So we don't just have a shift in the distribution to the right, making it a higher mean level of security investment. What we also have is sort of this new peak and this little bubble off to the edge. And so we did a little bit of digging under the surface, because that struck us as there being potentially a main effect and then a subsidiary effect, of sort of more akin to sort of an interaction between some covariate and intentionality. And what we found was an interesting variable contributing in this respect might be, and I would emphasize the maybe part of this, the respondent gender. And what we observed is that generally speaking, both the men and women in the sample responded the same to exposure to ransomware, and that they both significantly increased their investment intentionality, but they started into different places and ended in different places as a result. And so you have this sort of interesting morphological change that occurs in the distribution as well. And I'll talk a little bit about what we think might be going on, but there's the obvious caveat that this could also be a statistical artifact as opposed to a substantive anything. But we did find it to be an interesting sort of shift. And so we thought we would include it in the paper and raise it today as a point of discussion. Okay, so I'll end with just the conclusions and implications, because my sense of the setup here, keep it short and then do some talking, and that's my preferred approach. So I think there's really like about 4 different implications that are worth bringing up at the end here. First, there is the possibility, given our results, which is more or less suggesting that the attack modality that seems to be most in vogue at the moment, encrypt systems, charge people ransoms, that is ransomware, might have this sort of tragedy of the commons dynamic at play for malicious actors. That if our results are indicative of what you actually see at various units of scale, for example, at cities or corporations or individuals, then the cumulative effect of a lot of malicious actors undertaking ransomware for the purpose of gaining quick monetary reward, which is sort of easier to accomplish than, say, exfiltrating millions of files and then trying to sell them on the dark web, as you would have with the data breach, that the individual incentive to do ransomware might cumulatively basically dry up the pool of potential victim targets as people start to invest more in cybersecurity. So assuming our results are robust across scales and assuming that intentionality translates over into some degree of investment that's greater than before, you could have malicious actors essentially sawing off the tree branch upon which they're standing when it comes to ransomware. The second point that I think is worth bringing up here is that if you were to think about this from the perspective of policy entrepreneurs in government or outside of government who are trying to affect government policy, you would generally find, I would imagine, that the window of opportunity for policy innovation, for additional regulation, is probably biggest when damage is highest. So if you see a trend, say, with increasing ransomware attacks, both in terms of frequency, in terms of number of victims, or in terms of monetary costs, that seems like a window that's ripe for government intervention and regulation. And what we're basically saying in the paper as a potential conclusion based on what we've found is that, okay, more costs is more of a problem. But the degree to which the ecosystem could be resilient and actually responsive in a decentralized, almost market-driven way is going to potentially be dependent upon the degree of cost internalization. So it might be too far to stress the idea that, if ransomware is highly cost internalizing, the government needs to do nothing as a policy actor. It is nevertheless possible that the degree of cost internalization should sort of expand or contract the policy window associated with the total magnitude or cost of the problem at hand. So it's sort of a variable to keep in mind when you're thinking about policy interventions. You also see something similar, I would argue, with regard to cyber insurance. If you think about typical insurance and port those intuitions over into the cyber insurance realm, past bad driving or past exposure to a cybersecurity event could be used as a predictor of future risk in sort of a very straightforward kind of actuarial way. And again, the results are basically saying, well, some future victimization, like being a victim of a data breach, might be a better predictor for future risk than other attacks types. So if you're a victim of ransomware, maybe your willingness to invest more in security as a proportion of your revenue or budget might actually increase at a rapider rate than otherwise might be the case. And so you're actually a less of a cyber insurance risk than you would be if you were targeted in a different way. I said we return to the sort of inductive look at the way in which the results sort of bore out across the respondent gender. And our argument in this regard, again, recognizing that it could be just a epiphenomenal statistical artifact, might be that you are dealing with essentially populations that have had different sort of exposure and opportunities with regards to STEM, science, computers, and so forth. And in that kind of setting, you might see, as we do, everybody responding in the same way because they're responding to incentives to invest more, but baseline levels of investment are lower in the one case than the other. And so you see sort of a shift in the line, the shift in the mean level of investment intentionality, but because you're starting at a lower point, you end up with this sort of difference in the sample. And finally, I think as a broad sort of point, this notion of thinking about perceived costs and perceived the degree to which they're internalized or externalized to victims gives you a way to look at a wider class of cybersecurity events to make sense of whether or not they're going to be positives or negatives with regards to what they're going to do, incentives to invest in security. Because security investment always seems to be this perennial kind of problem that is being undersupplied due to externalities. And so what we're basically saying is some attack types are, in effect, more or less self-correcting in terms of the effect on investment intentionality. So not everything that is a cybersecurity event has the same security under provision problem, potentially. Again, subject to caveats about scale and all of that. Yeah, so that's basically the paper in a nutshell. What I'll do, I think, is stop the share for now. And then if there are things people want to pivot back to, I can fire it back up, but it might be nicer for me on my end to be able to see people's faces. So thanks a lot. And I look forward to the conversation.
Hey, thank you so much, Eric. Quick round of applause. Really, really interesting stuff. Per usual, everybody, feel free to either use the chat or the raise hand feature. And we're just going to make our way around virtually, Eric. And I forgot to ask, could you stay a few minutes after, or do you have a hard stop at 1 if the discussion's keeping on going?
If people would like a little bit more time to chat, I'm happy to stick around.
Okay, yeah, no pressure, because we didn't discuss that in advance. So yeah, that's fine. Okay, so we have a little bit more flexibility there, guys. Though I do have a radio interview at 1, I just remembered. So I'll have to jump off then. So while folks are maybe thinking of some questions, I have so many. This is just fascinating work. It dovetails well with a report that we did here in the state, looking at how different organizations are responding kind of during the pandemic to cyber risks. And one of the I thought, at least, kind of one of the surprising findings, to pick up on your tragedy of the cyber commons point there, Eric, was that there was just a lot of confusion, particularly among local governments, which is playing out in a big way now with the infrastructure funding starting to flow, and for small businesses into just deciding, where do you put that next dollar of investment? So kind of to your point about ransomware potentially being a wake-up call, right? And then we start to see the investment dollars start to flow. Just in terms of policy impacts, I wonder if there's just not much more clarity on, well, do you put that next dollar into an encryption, multi-factor, backups, cyber hygiene training, or insurance for that matter, which I'd love to talk to you more about too. Does that translate actually to improved, overall cybersecurity at the end of the day? So I just was wondering to get your quick reactions to that, tragedy of the cyber commons point, and just still the continuing confusion we're seeing about what the heck is reasonable cybersecurity.
Yeah, I got to be honest. I had never thought of this point, but you're right. There's two possible, because investment is modular. Mm-hmm. There really is the possibility, as we've been interpreting it, that you would just expand your budget. Right. If you're thinking in like production possibility frontiers, you just invest more so you can spend more. Mm-hmm. What you're suggesting might also be the case, though. There may be this sort of nested effect where, okay, well, ransomware is, it's infecting our systems in this way, or through this attack vector. So we're going to reallocate from, say, human training towards that, or more likely you would reallocate towards human training so people stop clicking links. But to the extent that there are, so you might actually observe both, and that would be an interesting thing that we can't quite comment upon in any kind of concrete terms, but absolutely, you might see reallocation or distributional changes in addition to or instead of budgetary expansion. So we've been obviously thinking that it would be predominantly a budgetary expansion, but you might see, that's interesting. I never thought about that angle, but yeah.
Yeah, we can totally chat about it more. No, that's great. Thanks a lot. And Renee, please, kick us off. Otherwise, it's so good to see you. Oh, I think you might still be muted. I'm sorry. The joys of Zoom.
Sorry about that.
There we go.
So this is really fascinating. And so I have two, I won't even pretend they're questions. They're really sort of comments, but I'd like your response to them.
Sure.
The first is that when you said decentralized in a market-driven way, referring to the distribution of risks and harm, and therefore sort of the costs and what that would mean. The thing that came up in my mind was that this was a huge sort of large-scale political economy issue. There's always been a tension between the public provision of security, both from the criminal sort of policing side and the national security side, and the private provision, the do-it-yourself security. You've got to lock your door, you've got to have your insurance, you've got to update your software, right? So there's always been that tension. But it seems to me that we are either drifting or falling into or speeding towards more reallocating this balance so that it's much more private provision of security, do it yourself, you're on your own, than government intervention. So that was the first thing that just jumped out at me. Did you agree or disagree? And then related to this was that your focus is on perceived costs, which means that there are potentially unperceived costs. And that's a perverse incentive for government to avoid taking action, or for individuals even to avoid taking action, because there are probably risks here that are not recognized because people work on what they're perceiving as opposed to what might be considered a rational analysis of what the risks are. So those were my two comments. I'd love to hear your views.
Yeah, thanks for those. Yeah, so I'm going to take them in reverse order, I think, because with the real and perceived cost issue, I agree entirely that this is a domain where, even at the level of the behavior of the malicious actor, in most instances, and ransomware would be an exception, being discovered is not a positive thing. So if you're exfiltrating credit card numbers from a database, those retain their economic value so long as nobody knows that you have them. once they do, it's sort of been documented that the price per record just plummets. And so you have these various levels, this slippage between real and perceived costs, for sure. Where things I think get interesting is it is possible, at least theoretically, that the greater than sign could eat one or the other. So you could have a situation where the perceived costs are higher than the real costs. So ransomware might be an example. Because it is on your screen and salient, that might make individuals feel like the costs are extraordinarily high, even if it was all it really boiled down to was a commitment of time and $400 in Bitcoin that you put into a wallet out in the ether, and then you get the decryptor keys and your system's more or less back to normal. Maybe you start up a ransomware subscription or a antivirus subscription after the fact. And so you think that it's a very sizable and significant thing, but compared to, say, having your identity compromised as a result of a data breach, which might seem like it's less of a cost, the real costs are actually less than the perceived costs. So I think that generally you're going to have real costs be greater than perceived costs most of the time, but I think it's sort of part and parcel of the argument we're trying to make that sometimes attack modalities themselves might flip that sign so that perceived costs seem worse than real costs, at least in some instances. And that should contribute then to this notion of investment for individuals or up the sort of scale towards more complex organizations. I also agree entirely about the tension here, that like with a lot of things in society, you have some things are handled like national defense very centrally. We're not starting up private armies, although there are sort of private security companies that look a lot like armies. And then you've got this sort of safety or security devolution of responsibility to individuals or to companies or things of that nature. And I don't know how to really weigh in too much on this tension in this respect, other than to say that, I guess, other than to say maybe two things. One is that at a government level, so let's say a federal government level, the computational burden that would be associated with trying to provide security across the board, given the nature of distributed computers, devices, services, and so forth, would be probably impossible. And so there has to be some level of devolution of responsibility. Otherwise, you wouldn't have laptops, smartphones, discrete Wi-Fi networks, IoT devices, and all the rest. I just don't think you could have a government agency that could have a large enough bird's eye view to keep all of that safe and secure beyond sort of high level like NIST type standards that would let everybody have a degree of guidance about what to do, but doing it would still be implemented by others. So that would be one sort of thought here, is this the computational and observational problem from a government standpoint means there has to be some devolution of authority. And I guess the second thing that sort of relates to the argument at hand is that we're basically, I guess, arguing more or less that the responsiveness of individuals to that devolution, that I would argue is at least partially necessary, that's sort of variable about what's going on in the ecosystem. So just because you devolve security doesn't mean people act upon that devolution. So just because it's a good idea or advised that we lock our doors, it doesn't necessarily mean that we have to. Most people probably do, and you might find most people eventually using antivirus or whatever, some sort of cybersecurity related equivalent. So I think there's those two kind of component parts to your excellent point there.
Thanks a lot, Renee. And please do chime back in. That was fantastic. But it looks like Brian's next in the queue.
Okay, thanks. Interesting and quite clear paper. I have a couple of comments and then kind of a question topic. First of all, just something you may be quite aware of, but the paper comes across as a very conventional homo economicus rational choice model of what's going on, and really doesn't reflect any kind of, the stuff from behavioral economics, even basic risk aversion, let alone the dozens, or I think we're now up to hundreds of different things in terms of the heuristics through which people actually, process information and make decisions. So could be interesting, at least for further work or analysis. Secondly, and kind of following on what you were just talking about, this question of institutional choice or mix of institutional solutions is where I think the paper has the potential to think more about implications of, okay, you've got this one side where it's a classical, sorry, but miracle of the market. There is something that's going to help solve this, and you point to the DDoS example as another thing. And, that's fine and clear, but the implication is on the other side, well, wait a minute, what about the data breaches? Maybe that's the kind of situation where some other approach is more relevant. And for me, in terms of the workshop and so on, I would go back again. I really happen to like Carol Rose's approach, her classic book, Property and Persuasion, and it's available. She put the PDF online, so that's in the chat. But this basic framework of not just economists looking at a choice between taxation and regulation, but broadening it out and saying, legal perspective, and Scott and Angie know far more about this than I do, but liability and liability law and how the law treats these issues. And in cases like this, at what point, judges or legislatures say, this is too messy, we're going to impose strict liability or something else, because otherwise it gets too hard to deal with. And then Carol Rose and the book, and then a lot of the workshop stuff is, okay, when is collective action relevant for those who are trying to defend, and at, like you were saying, at what level? Okay, there's some broad things from NIST to whatever. You may have community groups, where does it make sense to work together or not? So those are the comments. And then the question, because I think you maybe do, at the end of the paper, you start talking about, well, some of this might apply to corporations, government departments, but might be different. So if you already have some thoughts about how that might be different, or how you go about trying to understand that, be interesting to hear. Thanks.
Yeah, well, thank you for the comments. I already clicked the link, which is bad cybersecurity practice, of course. But I'll take a look at the book because I'm not familiar, but it sounds fascinating. So I'm gonna have to do a little bit of digging there. The decision-making heuristic point is an excellent notion, and one that probably we should explore as we revise up the draft a little bit, because we are very much just sort of assuming that in aggregate, people are going to respond to heightened perceived costs in a, not identically, but generally all in sort of a common direction. You're not going to see somebody spinning off in the opposite way to be like, I was compromised, therefore I do less. But that is very, rational economics in that sense. So it's probably worth sort of dwelling a little bit upon whether we want a decision-making framework embedded in the paper that's a little bit more sophisticated than what we have, for sure. In terms of speculating about the layers of decision-making and so forth here, I mean, it gets increasingly complicated as you move up the level of organization from an individual who has sort of subject to budgetary constraints, more or less unlimited domain to dispose of their devices as they choose. So they could decide to just toss out their laptop and never buy another one, or they could choose to get it cleaned up and buy a ransomware or antivirus subscription and so forth. When you start to move up into, say, organizations or into government, obviously you have a greater mandate for a variety of things, and that starts to weigh in pretty heavily. So I don't know if there would be an answer other than to say, you'd probably have, sector and organizational size of specific differences at a minimum that I would expect, technology companies, as one example, to respond differently than oil and gas companies, to respond differently than logging companies or manufacturing companies and stuff like that, because you probably would see the relevance of IT systems in their various domains of work would be different. And then you probably have some pretty large differences by size, just independent of anything else. that really large organizations, to Scott's point, might have more resources that they could reallocate without ever having to expand budgets, and they might have more ability to expand budgets as well in a small organization. So if it's, you know, to shrink it down to the very smallest size, if you have like an individual kind of, you know, I have a cobbler who fixes my shoes, and near as I can tell, it's a man and his wife runs the gift shop next door and he runs the cobbler store. My guess is their organization as a business would not respond well to exposure to cybersecurity, because they probably don't have the capital to expend, as opposed to, say, you know, a major oil company, which could, if they needed to, expand budgets or pretty sizably. So size matters, I think. Sector would matter. And when you move into the government setting, you probably have the sort of difference between marginal costs, which nominally speaking are supposed to be more or less equal to marginal benefits in the private sector, and then total costs and total benefits, which is supposed to be equal in the public sector. So my guess is the flexibility, beyond being able to like just print money, my guess is the flexibility within government to expand budgets for cybersecurity to be even larger. And so I guess if I was to really make a guess, I would assume that the degree of response, if you were to be able to find like a sample like we have, but in the private sector, or find a sample like we have among, say, government organizations across units of scale, that my guess would be our estimation of the effect size is sort of like half a unit of standard deviation, is probably forming more or less a floor, would be my guess. This is the degree. I would expect organizations that are bigger and more complex could probably respond to a greater degree than what we're observing here. Individuals might be more inherently capped in terms of their ability to respond. That's a guess or a hypothesis in the language of statistics, but it seems like it might be right, but then you would need the sample in order to test it.
Thanks a lot, Eric. Did you have a follow-up, Brian, or are you good for now? Okay, cool. And others like Larry, I see you. Others, feel free to chime in as well. Okay, including the students. Would love to hear from the students. And on that point, I'm wondering, Eric, you know, being that you're a professor of political science, you're tackling this stuff and the true workshop tradition with a variety of different methods. And this paper is just one example of that. I'm wondering if you could just speak briefly about how you see, you know, the study of cybersecurity and political science as kind of a field, right? How you see it evolving a little bit. And the one reason that comes to mind is not only to help, you know, inform the fellows and students on the call here who are thinking about, you know, taking this literature in so many different directions, but also, you know, just a few days ago, we had the first cyber safety review board get finally staffed and stood up, which is the idea is to have a version of the NTSB for cybersecurity. And if you look at the membership of that board, they're going to be doing a lot of deeply interdisciplinary investigations about these types of failings, right? What went wrong? Whose fault was it? At what level? What was the core governance failure, right? And at least my initial discussions with DHS, I feel like political science, kind of organizational behavior more generally, was frankly a bit of a blind spot in that. So I'm wondering, just as you think about distilling down some of these findings, also for policymakers, how we can do a better job of educating educating these policymakers about this kind of work, which is going to be really important if that kind of a board is going to be successful.
Sure. I mean, I can start with a sort of anecdote from when I got started in the space, because I finished my PhD without having studied any of this stuff. I was, you know, looking at rebel groups, and they were all pre-internet even in terms of the case studies that I'd selected. And, you know, being a recently minted PhD who needed a job, I applied for one that was going to require cybersecurity research and internet governance related research more broadly, and sort of dove into some of the big debates at the time. This was around 2014, so you had debates about a variety of things at play. And I remember reading through it, and, you know, without going into too many of the details, essentially the battle lines, to use some hyperbolic language that had been drawn at that point, were basically exactly what you could have predicted without knowing anything about internet governance at the time. So you had the United States, it was all about the ICANN disputes and these sorts of things. You had the United States and its sort of allied blocks up against, China, Saudi Arabia, Russia, in terms of an alternative view, the sort of multilateral view. So there is, at one intrinsic level, politics is politics, and it doesn't matter if you're talking about technology or other things. So generally speaking, the training that you would receive in, say, a social science background like I had was transferable in a way. So there are details that you need to get up to speed with. There's a different acronym soup that you need to get up to speed with, and those are always things that you encounter in any switch between domains. But countries are countries, and they have long-standing histories, and those things are thought about more, well, I don't want to say more concretely, but that is sort of the point of, say, international relations as a subset of political science, was to think about the relationship between states and those antagonistic views. And so those tools help me, initially dive into the space. And then from there, as might be the case with a lot of people, I sort of just gained general interest in the whole domain, never looked back, and I'm super happy with where everything has turned out. And less anecdotally and more about the sort of conversion of expertise into what would you say, into things that people will listen to. I think there's, generally speaking, there are blinders at play that I think are weakening over time. Initially there was a lot of computer scientists and computer and electrical engineers sort of ruled the roost. But increasingly lawyers seem to be doing really well, specifying sort of the legal parameters within which things play out. Political scientists, I think, are maybe not playing as primary a role as they might, but reflecting on my own discipline where I'm still housed, I think that's partially due to the political scientists, not the other side of the equation. And I think a new crop of students, if the students we have as any indication, are getting increasingly interested in these things and learning the sort of interdisciplinary skills that you need in order to engage effectively. Because you cannot be completely blind to the technical side and do particularly well, I don't think. But you can bring your own tools and then merge it with an understanding of the technical side, I think. Yeah, so a bit of a longer and meandering answer, but the thing for students, I would say, is more or less that if you're interested, there are no barriers. You just have to leverage your tools. You'll make an interesting contribution in your own little way. And so my particular way tends to be a background in political science and economics paired with methodological training. That's my thing. Other people do their thing, and that's good. And we all sort of toss it out there and we see what happens. And if some of it sticks to the wall and some of it just slides right down.
Well done. I don't want to monopolize this. If anybody else has a question or comment for Eric, feel free. I have about 10 minutes left. I'll maybe throw out just one other one while folks are thinking, Eric. And you brought up the insurance point, which I think is a kind of an interesting one, right? Because especially during the pandemic, we've seen rates really rocket up. I mean, for all kinds of insurance, right? But including cyber risk insurance. And, just anecdotally, I'm on the board of directors for our local food bank here, and our policy was dropped. It wasn't renewed, and we didn't even experience a cyber attack, right? And from what I understand, it's increasingly common, if you're a nonprofit, if you're a local government, to just be priced out of this market. The idea is, they just don't have the resources or the expertise to be able to invest, and we're just not even going to bother. And to the extent that we want to have insurance be a useful tool, to mitigate risk the way we do so many other, kinds of climate risks, you name it. It just seems to me that we're in a difficult point. and there doesn't seem to be, at least in my mind, maybe you can help us out, kind of an easy out here. I've heard discussions of kind of like what we do with flood insurance, having like a public back option for cyber risk insurance so that local government, small businesses could have somewhere to turn. But good Lord, is that going to be expensive? I'm wondering, do you have any any insights based on your work, this work in particular, about how maybe this could be a useful metric, right? As insurance companies think about updating their actuarial models to make them a little bit more robust, could previous exposures to ransomware, in other words, as you were saying, actually be something of a plus rather than a minus.
Right.
What do you think there?
Yeah, I mean, the insurance one is a complicated and evolving scenario, and there's a few layers that I'd point to. One problem is definitely the accuracy of the actuarial models. I mean, there's a lot of smart people trying to develop these, but then the ecosystem changes so rapidly that you don't have something like, say, a population mortality risk table that is pretty invariant over long stretches of time, which would allow you to calibrate pricing really well. Instead, you have like, okay, we got a model based on the last 4 years, and then all of a sudden, 2016 hits and WannaCry emerges and ransomware is the new thing. And then all of a sudden the pricing models have to shift. The other problem that's sort of nested in that is, and Dan and Aaron and I, as well as a few others, have measured this empirically. You have what is known as like a power law distribution for ransoms. And so very similar to catastrophe insurance, where it's sort of priced relative to these like, once in a century floods, you have that exact same problem at play here, except you have greater frequency. So instead of having, a once in a century flood, maybe once in a century, so very large, very damaging, requires large payouts, but it's rare. You have requires large payouts, but they're common. And in terms of temporal frequency, but not in terms of distribution. So you just have so many attacks, but there's enough of them that are large enough that is pricing and paying for the premiums have to go up, I guess, in order to compensate. It leads to your comment about the board that you're on, and maybe the need for a government-backed policy framework that would essentially allow smaller organizations to leverage the benefits of insurance while not going bankrupt to try to do it. That might be an interesting way forward. And there was like the golden dream of cyber insurance is essentially that it can be more or less a disciplinary measure. Not the insurers themselves, because they're there for revenue purposes, but others view insurance as a way in which you can condition the behavior of the policyholders. So you have various things like this. Is it CMIC, the cyber maturity model that DoD put out? Yeah. CMIC, yeah. So that, that is a non-insurance, but a procurement version that's sort of indicative of what the positive view about insurance's role might be, that because you have this cybersecurity underinvestment problem, you'd be able to use the policies, which would require certain, say, system specs or training programs and so forth, in order to be compliant with the policy, that it would improve cybersecurity. And I guess from our standpoint, from this paper, the notion is there is this layer that's added on top of it. So yeah, insurance could be a disciplinary measure in the sense of encouraging people to undertake security steps that they would otherwise not, in order to be compliant with the premium or compliant with the plan, or drive down the premium or something like that. And we're basically saying, sure, they could still operate. However, you might also have a reduction in or an increased investment simply as a function of essentially the economic forces unleashed by specific attack types. Yeah, so not a comprehensive answer per se, but there's the insurance thing is not going away. And I think it's just, we haven't figured out exactly how to manage, especially the event frequency coupled with its distribution is, I think, a real problem here. It's hard for me to envision how you make a ton of money as an insurer because of the nature of the events themselves.
Sure. Yeah, my gosh, this is one other quick anecdote, but we're on the Indiana Executive Council for Cyber, and we got basically a warning last week to basically beware of, Russian-backed cyber attacks targeting critical infrastructure across Indiana. So, I mean, just about the geopolitical aspects of all this, these nation-state sponsored attacks. That's why I think political science can just be so useful in helping us, think about this and some useful new directions. And Larry, a great comment there. Eaton, though, Eric was asking about, how attitudes potentially have changed. We're just freaked out at so many levels about so much stuff these days. Ransomware seems to be cutting through. That's still another thing to be worried about, right? But I'm wondering when the data or when the survey was, data was collected, if that was more or less during the pandemic, and if you think that might be interesting to kind of go back post-pandemic. And then if you wanted to comment at all on Eden's other kind of related questions about the dangers of remote work, feel free to. Yes,
I was just wondering if we're talking about polycentricity and actors and users governance, maybe like since the pandemic when everyone is working remotely and there is more dangers, you basically have more actors that are engaged enough or in danger enough that would like to that are playing, and therefore they are changing the cooperative action.
Yeah, well, so I think there's an interesting layer here because I'm working off of memory. So I stand to be corrected, but if memory serves, in the initial stages of the COVID-19 pandemic, attacks fell, if I'm not mistaken. And you had an opportunity for, say, attacks on the health sector that had the potential in terms of, malicious actor benefit to have a really high conversion rate because you needed hospitals to be operational, and yet the attacks were far less forthcoming than you might expect from a strictly like reward-based standpoint. I wouldn't necessarily claim morality among thieves in this setting, but at least in the beginning, things seem to be on pause relative to what I'd anticipated something far worse than what happened. Now that has obviously changed over time. The attacks have picked back up again, and so forth. And you do have this sort of interesting layer of a layer here with a move to more remote activities, in that because our dependence upon the technologies increased during 2020, 2021, and into 2022, the costs associated with disruption have risen. And so again, from just from a more of a preventive standpoint, so less of how do you react to actually having a problem, your greater reliance on the technology should also mean you are a little bit more you're a little bit more interested or willing to foot the bill for, say, security expenditures, I would assume, again, sort of on average. And then the last thing in this respect is you have an interesting sort of nested measurement problem at play that I'm not sure exactly how it pans out, but attacks might go up, but use goes up faster. And so, individual risk of victimization is actually less than it used to be. And so this is a point I've made in some other published work about the relevancy of statistical normalization when talking about cybersecurity incidents. Because if you don't, and you're just looking at, say, the count of events, they're going to constantly increase over time because we're using computers more and more, there's more internet access. And so you'll have more attacks. And to actually assess risk, you need rates, which we, just sort of an intuition ported directly over from, say, offline crime statistics, that if you have a big city, you're going to have more crimes. But if you have a big city, you've got more people. And so your risk of victimization as a function of the number of people might actually be lower. And so this is something with regards to your comment and the time frame of question here that I'm not sure how it plays out, that maybe we are seeing more attacks than we otherwise would, but we're spending almost all of our time online, and our risk of victimization as a function of hours online or number of people online is lower. But that's a measurement question that has to be sort of determined. And I see some people that have to run, so just thank you to everybody in case you need to step off.
Yep, no, absolutely. Thanks everybody for joining. How about one more round of applause for Eric? Really, really great job.
Thank you all.
So many others in the chat. Really, really interesting stuff, Eric. And for anybody who is able to, keep the discussion going, please do. I'm sorry I have to drop off, Eric, but it's so great seeing you.
You too.